Okay, so tonight's talk is focused on anxiety. And the title of the talk, which you may have seen, is it's kind of creative. When a Buddha panics, using wisdom to deal with anxiety. So when you see the title, you may think at first, well, do Buddhas panic? Um, when you think of the Buddha, you may think of the kind of utmost peaceful person. Would they panic? Well, what I meant with that was that actually we're the Buddhas, or we are baby Buddhas, people who have not yet realized how to be completely peaceful or unmoved, even in the most challenging circumstances. So we're the baby Buddhas, or the not yet um, realized Buddhas who panic. If you didn't know, the word Buddha means someone who is awakened or wakeful, which just means it's a person who is completely aware of themselves. They have perfect self-awareness so that actually they wouldn't panic. Panic is a result of not being aware, not being fully self-aware, which I'll talk about in a bit. So, although we are not yet as wakeful as the Buddha or Buddhas, we all have the same potential. We're all just human beings. And most, if not all of us, experience anxiety. So this is the starting point from tonight's talk. First, I just like to define anxiety and use a more secular definition of it before getting into a Buddhist understanding of anxiety. So we can say that anxiety, and bear with me, I'll define the difference between degrees of anxiety, including fear. Anxiety is an experience of persisting distress about the future, or it's just an experience of distress regarding our future. I think we've all experienced this anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen to us in the future. And it brings about a feeling of dis-ease and agitation. And when I say it's persistent, anxiety refers to a persistent dis-ease about the future. This could be a few minutes, it could be a few days, or it could be ongoing. Some people experience a continuous, almost constant experience of anxiety. Um, but what are the signs of anxiety? Well, with anxiety, our heart usually beats faster or more pronounced. Our breathing is usually affected, so our breathing becomes more coarse. Sometimes we sweat even, right? Sweat when we're nervous to start something that's anxiety provoking. Excessive thoughts and thinking, and even trembling or muscle tension, erratic muscle tension in our body. Sometimes we may experience this heaviness in our chest. And for some people, they experience bowel movements or digestion, not only feelings in the stomach, so-called butterflies in the stomach, but even, bowel movements or gas because of this dis-ease throughout the body and mind. And when anxiety comes to a peak in the field that I work in as a counselor, The word panic attack describes the peak moment of anxiety, where a person can experience all of those symptoms I just mentioned to a very severe degree, to the point where a person may think that they feel like they're going to die because the heart's beating so fast, the breathing is so coarse, and the mind is racing. Thoughts are racing. So if anxiety is severe enough in this field of counseling, a person is diagnosed with a disorder, which just means that there's something about the way they're functioning, the way their mind is functioning, that's creating a problem for their life. And if it's a more general kind of anxiety, anxious about many things, um, there's a term for that called generalized anxiety disorder. If it's a specific anxiety, a person is anxious about something in particular, for example, using an elevator, maybe afraid of a certain kind of animal, dogs, spiders, or even heights. That's called a phobia. There's a specific topic or object of anxiety. um, in Buddhism, of course, there's a different way to categorize or describe anxiety. Sometimes the word anxiety is used, sometimes fear. Technically, Buddha didn't speak English, so neither of those words were used. But some of the terms used during his time could be roughly translated as this, just this persistent feeling of distress, often about the future, where our mind is dwelling in the future and often dwelling in um, negative outcomes, potential negative outcomes, something bad that can happen. I had a lot of personal experience with anxiety when I had just finished college. It was a point in my life where I was working, but it was a part-time job and it wasn't related to my degree. And I had relatively stable social relationships, but just had this pattern of anxiety related to everything. I felt it was this, in social situations, I felt anxious. I even felt anxious about things completely unrelated to me. I remember one day driving and just thinking about how skyscrapers are built and how huge and tall they are. And I think to myself, what if these buildings would fall down? What if the building collapses? Aren't the engineers afraid that when they're building this thing that it could fall down? How could they even start? Would they even dare to build such a structure? Wouldn't they be afraid that it would fall down? So I wasn't involved in construction at all, but my mind would go in this direction. Whenever I'd think about something, I'd often think about a potential danger or a potential catastrophe. So many people find themselves with this kind of anxiety. There's no specific theme, but their mind just tends to think and overthink of the potential problems and bad outcomes that they could experience. But what about fear? Oftentimes, the word fear is used together with anxiety, and it can be difficult to distinguish sometimes. Um, but fear we could look at as a sense of dis-ease or concern for our well-being in the immediate future when we're presented with an immediate perceived threat. So, for example, and I like to use this one, if we're walking in the woods and we encounter this giant bear, at that moment, we may have a sudden rush of without using the word fear, a sudden rush of distress and agitation, because immediately our mind goes to, am I unsafe? Could I be harmed by this bear? It goes to the future, but it's the near future. Um, and if the bear walks off and we feel that we're safe, we're a safe distance, the fear passes. It's no longer a continuing distress. So fear and anxiety, it's the same quality of experience. Fear or concern about the future, concern about our well-being in the immediate future and possible risk of harm. The difference is anxiety is something usually persistent and ongoing, whereas fear comes and goes with the immediate circumstance. But what's interesting is that whether we use the word fear or anxiety, they're both triggered by our perception of threat or a potential bad outcome, right? So if we're in the woods and we're an inexperienced hiker, we see a bear, maybe immediately we become afraid because the first thought may be, oh my God, it's a bear. Bears kill people or attack people. We may perceive a threat, but meanwhile, that bear is minding its own business, doesn't care about people. It's got a full stomach. There's no babies or young that they're taking care of. And the bear just either looks at us and walks away um, or runs away. Black bears in New York here often would run away when they see people. An experienced hiker may see a bear and not immediately experience fear because they see the same thing. Let's say these two hikers are together. The experienced hiker sees there's no threat at all. Their perception is that there's no threat at all. So they don't experience fear. But is there actually a threat or not? It often depends on our subjective perception. If the bear charges, it may seem like it's a definite threat and we're going to be harmed. But then again, is that necessarily the case? It could just charge. It could just, um, what's the word for that? Bluff or have a threatening stance, but it may not attack. So it's just interesting to know that a lot of our anxiety and fear response comes from a subjective perception, which is oftentimes false. So if we just look at our own experience now and how Buddhism talks about fear and anxiety, because Buddhism is, I see Buddhism as a science of the mind. However, it's a science where we are, it's a science where we're not looking at someone else's mind. We're not observing another person's mind and doing analytical study, but we're observing our own mind and body and how it responds to situations moment by moment. So in our own experience, when we're anxious, we're often just obsessively thinking about the future and, as I said, possible bad outcomes. If you feel anxious a lot, um, it's also possible that you have a quality which is helpful for you in life, but that can turn into a problem and create anxiety. And that could be that you're really good at planning. You're very good at planning and problem solving to the point where you may analyze and assess a situation to the point where by assessing all the possible bad outcomes, you may find yourself unable to make a decision. And the popular phrase for that is analysis paralysis, right? Where we may think of all the possible outcomes to the point where we just don't know what to do because they all may seem bad, or there may be danger in or a possible poor outcome in all of those options. So although analysis and problem solving can be useful, if we have a tendency to um, get caught in that, that can create a lot of anxiety. Getting caught or using this tool of problem solving in an unskillful way, we can cause trouble for ourselves. In the same way that a knife is a really useful tool, we can cut things and carve things and make things. But if we're not skillful with the knife, we can cut ourselves. And what do we usually worry about? Like, what is the content of anxiety? When we talk about possible bad outcomes, we're usually thinking about what? Something that could happen to our body, our physical condition, harm our body, cause us to become ill or, to suffer a great injury or die. But we may also worry about damage to our self-image and worry about how people think of us and if our reputation would be harmed by such and such an outcome. So we worry about our physical body, we worry about the image that we present or the image that others have of us. And of course, we may worry about our possessions, whether that's physical objects or people in our lives, uh, people that we feel belong to us, either our family, our partners, whoever we consider that belongs to us, we may worry about them as well. And it's interesting to look at the deeper level of anxiety, that we not only worry about harm to ourselves or others who belong to us, but it's a kind of anxiety comes from wanting to control, wanting to control a situation or to control other people. I have a client who's investing in stock market, and cryptocurrency is a real popular thing. So a lot of people are investing in it. And this one person, shared that he has so much of his hope for the future invested in it that he worries a lot about, whether the stock's going up or whether the stock is going down. Um, and in a sense, he wants to control it. I mean, I think if you've played the stocks, you can relate to this. You just want to wait till it gets to the right point and either buy or sell. So part of us just wants to control the direction of um, the price of the stock. But maybe it's people. Maybe you wish to control a family member. And when I say control, it may be a very loving intention. We may hope that our family member is well and healthy. We hope that they get themselves in a better situation. So we want better for them. We want them to live a fulfilling life. But we, in the process, may also want them to make decisions that we think are correct. And we may tell them all the time, oh, you should do this, you should do that, you should live this way, you should do that, and you'd be fine. Listen to me, I'm telling you. You should study Buddhism. You'll straighten everything out. We may have good intention, but because of this deep sense of wanting to control others, fix others, and have them accept our views and our ideas, that can also lead to anxiety because it's impossible. It's impossible to control others, yet we forget that. So we still try in all different ways. And maybe some of us want others to like us. We want to be approved of by others. And that could create a great deal of anxiety. I have another client who's working for a company, and they really want their boss to see how hard they're working. They want to get approved of. So they work hard, and they end up actually working a lot of overtime and sometimes working to the point of really being exhausted. And that exhaustion leads to, you know, a pretty bad state, a bad condition. So it actually becomes harder for them to perform well at work because they're so exhausted. But they keep pushing themselves because they want approval. And they're continuously anxious about if people will approve of them or not. So that's an ongoing, persistent sense of anxiety coming from wanting to control things. On a deeper level, though, is it is it true that the fear of death is at the root of all of our anxieties? And maybe we'd have to dig deeper to look into this. But if we look at each individual's persisting anxiety, and look layer by layer, what are they anxious about? What are they trying to control and why? And then another layer, well, why would they want to control that? And another layer, why would they want to control that? Because we want to survive and we want to avoid death at all costs. Um, Even while a person could be having great fun and enjoying themselves and experiencing a lot of fulfillment in some activity, in the back of their mind, they may still be thinking about or worrying about death and how all this will be over. They won't be able to enjoy themselves like they are now. But can we control that? Can we control life and death? And of course, we know the answer to that. We can't control that. We can't control when we die. We can't control how. We can try to live longer. We can try all sorts of things to become, um, well, not become immortal, but we may try, may try all sorts of things to extend our life. But it's inevitable that this life will pass. And that can be a deep, persistent sense of anxiety that's often in the back of our minds, but that can surface in certain situations. So, what's the cause of anxiety based on Buddhist understanding of the mind? We could say that the cause of anxiety and the cause of all other kinds of psychological disease, um, anger, craving, jealousy, doubt, um, confusion. We could go through all the list of possible psychological disease, and the source is still the same for all of them. Buddhism talks about the source of anxiety as ignorance. The word that's translated to English as ignorance, originally is the Chinese is wu ming. Um, can't remember the Sanskrit offhand, but wu ming also means lacking clarity. Lacking clarity. We could also stretch the stretch the translation to meaning lacking awareness, lacking self-awareness, or lacking awareness of the workings of our mind, workings of our body, mind. Um, it doesn't mean we're just lacking knowledge. Like if we understood something, then we would be not ignorant, but knowledgeable. It doesn't refer to lacking knowledge. It refers to lacking awareness of how our mind's working. When we lack awareness of how our mind is working, we'll lack awareness of the nature of everything, of all phenomenon, including our mind, our body, the physical world, people, everything. Because we use our mind to experience the world. If our mind is not clear, how could the world be clear to us? Um, how can we be clear about our relationship in this world if our mind is clouded or dark, so to speak? And it may sound strange to some people, especially if they're quite knowledgeable about how the world works. In terms of their personal experience, they may have lived a very rich, fulfilling, or even just have had many life experiences. So they have knowledge about themselves and people, experiences that help them know about the world and make better decisions. That's useful. Buddhism doesn't deny the use of that knowledge and experience. And if you just went onto a person in the street and said that they're ignorant and they don't understand themselves, that would probably be insulting at first, and they just wouldn't agree with it. They may think, I know myself, I know who I am. You don't know who I am, but I know who I am. But how well do we know ourselves? Or how clear are we of the workings of our mind, including our thinking, including our ability to perceive things, not just thinking, but our ability to observe and see and hear and feel. Um, how well do we know ourselves and know our own mind? Oftentimes, we just know our subjective perception about the world. We have our knowledge that's accumulated. We have all of our thoughts and ideas based on experience. And we also have thoughts and ideas based on knowledge that's been given to us by other people. But ignorance, if we look closely, is where we're limited in our understanding of the world to our own thoughts. Our thoughts create the way we understand the world. If we only see our own thoughts and we take our own ideas and thoughts to be the way the world is, the way everything is, then we're limited, aren't we? It's kind of like there's a saying that it's kind of like reading a menu at a restaurant and thinking that we know what the food is like compared to just eating the food and experiencing it directly as we eat it. When we eat the food, then we know, what does it taste like? What is it like? If we just read a menu, how much can we know about the food? That's like how if we are fixated on our thoughts, the images and the words of our mind as being some ultimate reality out there, then we're We're really limited to just that static knowledge, which really boils down to just images and words. But these images and words of our mind can be so captivating. Um, Kind of like how a movie can captivate us, especially if the whole theater is dark. If we're in a movie theater, everything is dark. Let's say we're all alone in this theater, so there's no people to distract us. The theater is dark, and who knows, maybe you have a headset on, one of those VR headsets, and maybe maybe you're in the full suit, so you even feel based on what the movie is projecting. It seems so real because the images are so captivating and the sounds are so captivating. That's kind of like ignorance. Everything is dark, and there's just this display of movies of our mind. But if we were to all of a sudden turn on the lights in the theater, or, you know, take off the headset and maybe look at it from a distance into the viewfinder instead of having it covering the eyes, but we hold the viewfinder at a distance and we see it's just a bunch of images and sounds. That's like where we start to have a bit more clarity and awareness and some distance from the movies of the mind. We're less captivated and less um, absorbed by them. In Buddhism, the Diamond Sutra uses four words to describe how the images of our mind construct our experience of the world. Um, in the Diamond Sutra, there's something called the 四相, or the four forms. Could also be translated as four images. The 四相, the word 相, is composed, this character is composed of the image of a tree and then the character for an eye, like an eyeball. So it's an eye looking at a tree, and that's the word for image, which could also be translated as concept or form in terms of form and shape. So the Diamond Sutra talks about the concept of self, the image of self, whatever word works for you, the concept of self, the concept of other, the concept of all kinds of being, and the concept of time. Um, we have a notion of ourself, we have a notion of a being or a person opposite to us. We also have a notion of a world of separate beings, all having their own separate, completely individual, separate qualities. And then time, that all of us are persisting through time. These are the basic building blocks of ignorance. It's the basic building blocks of intelligence also. The capacity to analyze and make distinctions. We use concepts. And it's an amazing tool for us to create and to function as a society. But the problem lies when we attach to these concepts as true and real. When we attach to these concepts, we believe that we are completely separate beings and completely permanent. I am permanent, and everything else other than me is also separate and permanent. I mean, just think of our own experience or your own experience of thinking and reflecting on a situation in life. We think about ourselves, we think about the people involved, and somehow it seems like it's the same person. We're the same person that was involved in that situation back then. Hey, remember that party we had back then? It was Fourth of July party. It was so great that party we had. We did this, we did that. Doesn't it feel like we're somehow the same person and those people involved are somehow the same? And there's a definite sense that we're separate. We have our complete individuality. Again, there's a function to this. There's a function to thinking and discriminating. But when we're unclear that this is what our mind is doing, that's when the trouble starts. That's when we get captivated by the movie and we often can't get out. Once we're captivated by the movie and things seem so real and permanent, then that's when we invest so much energy into acquiring what's good and trying to get rid of what's bad. Any of the objects that we think about that we want, um, or any of the objects or people we think about that we don't want, we can invest a lot of energy and obsessively think and worry about, is it going to be good or is it going to be bad? And for the people who experience a lot of anxiety, they tend to get caught in the thinking of the negative outcomes. If this happens, it's going to be bad. I know this is going to happen. Or will this happen? I'm not sure if the good thing will happen. I'm pretty sure the bad thing will happen. Well, let's see, how can we avoid the bad thing from happening? It makes sense to try to avoid danger and to maintain safety. But what happens when we're lacking awareness is we get lost in the movie of catastrophe. And that phrase is used in modern psychology, catastrophizing, where it's a pattern of thinking, which is just thinking of the worst, obsessing over the worst possible situation. That brings anxiety and a persisting anxiety. The anxiety persists, all the feelings and symptoms persist because the lack of awareness and that catastrophical thinking persist. If we look closely, the attachment to those concepts of self and others, permanence, that persists. As long as attachment persists, anxiety will persist. So ignorance, attachment is the source, or we could say the root of all kinds of anxiety. I think it can be hard to, sometimes hard to digest just these concepts. Sometimes when I'm talking about them, it feels very theoretical. Um, but it can help to reflect on this. And one way of reflecting is to just sit with ourselves and not only think about these concepts I'm presenting, but sit with yourself and just reflect on if you're worrying about something. What is happening within your mind? And do you believe that the thing that you fear or the thing that you feel anxious about is somehow permanent? Or do you fear that somehow you're all alone and isolated from everybody else out there? Think about a situation, if you're worrying about a situation that you have to encounter and that your reputation could be damaged, like you're afraid someone's going to think you're a fool. Like for myself, I've been giving talks for quite a few years, and I still get a little bit of anxiety in the beginning. Is the talk going to be good? Am I going to present the information well? It's a little bit of anxiety for the first couple of minutes before it begins, and quickly it's just passes. Um, but when I started, I was paralyzed with fear before giving talks for a long time, not only for a few minutes, but it was days before the talk that I'd think about it and wonder, oh, how am I going to appear to people? Am I going to say the right thing? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I forget what to say? Are people just going to think at the time I was a monk, are people going to think I'm like just a young, stupid monk, who doesn't know anything? I'd worry about how people would see me. So even if some people did think that, hey, that was a really bad talk, that was a really bad talk, the information was bad, how long do you think they would think about me? Or if it's yourself, how long do you think they'll be thinking about your performance? Is it permanent? Are they going to be constantly thinking about how bad that one moment was? And you may think, well, maybe they're not thinking about it all the time, but what if they post it on social media? What if they post something that says how terrible it was, right? We see this a lot now. People's reputation is damaged from people posting things, information being posted, and it seems like it's permanent once it's posted. But is it really permanent? You know, and do people think about um, our poor performance again and again? In reality, people are thinking about themselves and probably anxious about their own problems. They're not going to be thinking about us all the time. But when we worry in our minds, isn't it true that there's a sense that it's somehow permanent, that our reputation is permanently damaged? That's the illusion that's created by our constant thinking. If we constantly think and worry about a damaged reputation, then for us it already feels permanent because it's ongoing recycling of this same theme, the same worry. So this is how with this uh, lack of awareness, that the very process of thinking creates a sense of permanence and creates a sense of very strong separation between ourself and others to the point where we feel isolated. So, how do we deal with this? How do we resolve this problem? Buddhist practice is all about developing awareness. We could say it's about developing self-awareness, awareness of how our mind is working. We could also say it's reclaiming our innate capacity to be wakeful. As I said in the beginning, the word Buddha means someone who's wakeful, completely awake. We all have this capacity, but we just have a tendency to be unwakeful. We have an incredibly strong tendency to be unaware and fixated on the content of our minds. Buddhist practice is seeing that. The first step is seeing that. So if we look at the teachings of the Buddha, it's kind of interesting how all the words and theories and teachings that come out of Buddhism are all words and ideas to help us realize the limitations of words and ideas. They're like a medicine to help us cure our illness of being fixated on concepts, words, and ideas. So the very idea of impermanence, Chinese is wu chang, it's just an antidote to the idea or sense of permanence, right? Um, Another concept of selflessness or not self, just talked about in Buddhism quite a lot, which is related to the idea of uh, everything being conditioned. Not self doesn't mean that, non-existence. It just means that everything comes about because of many different conditions. There's no eternal self inside of our body, mind, or even outside of our body and mind. Although we may believe it, like I just mentioned, the movie that plays in our mind gives us an impression that there's something about us that's always the same. It's the same me 20 years ago who went through all this stuff, and now it's the same me now that can think and reflect on it. Is it the same me? If so, where is that self? Buddhism uses the term no self or not self as an antidote to this misperception that there is a self, there is something that's the same, continuing within us. Um, the teachings of Buddhism are like a medicine, antidotes to help us release all of these wrong perceptions we have about reality, about ourself and the world. All of our misperceptions that come from being lost in thought, fixated on concepts. So just another simple example of how concepts really distort reality is just think about an orange and how an orange, there's a whole orange. We look at it, we say this is an orange. When we open it up, you peel an orange, the orange is made of sections. And we can peel one out, right? If we peel the orange, it's quite easy to get a complete section out. Nice, clean little piece of orange. And it seems like once we peel it and open it, it's a separate thing. That piece, there's a word for that. I can't remember it. That section of orange seems like it's now completely independent. But in reality, that piece of the orange wouldn't exist without the whole of the orange. Although it has some identifiable separateness, what would it be without the whole of the orange? It wouldn't exist at all. We often view the world like that. Our mind divides everything into pieces. The Chinese word for that is 分别心. And it's interesting, the two characters 分别 just mean to divide. We divide the world into pieces with our concepts. And it really feels that we have this complete independence from other things and other people. Buddhism says that's a misperception. There's no doubt that we can move our body, we can make decisions without someone else, controlling us from behind like some marionette. But we're not completely separate from the world either, because our body, just our physical body, depends on the whole world for it to exist. If we couldn't breathe, what would our body be? If we couldn't eat, what would our body be? If we didn't have the education we did to know how to take care of our body, what would our body be? What would our mind be without the education we were given or without all the interaction we're constantly having with other people? What would our mind be? Just think about that. Sometimes we feel that we have these really unique ideas and they just come from within ourselves. And yes, we can have some very unique ideas, but aren't those ideas also built upon everything else we've received from our contact with the world? What could we create without all of that information um, that we've got from contacting other people? other beings and all the environments we find ourselves in. So Buddhism, when it uses these ideas of impermanence, not self, and the integration or interconnectedness of things, this is just an antidote to help us start to loosen our attachment to our rigid views that create permanence, that create a sense of complete individuality and separateness. So the theory of Buddhism can help us start to observe our mind and start to question the assumptions we have about ourselves and the world. Um, but these concepts and theories of Buddhism can't just resolve anxiety. It's only a tool to help us to begin to observe deeply ourselves, which is where the practice comes in. Theory of Buddhism gives us a direction, helps us loosen our fixation to our concepts and our thinking. But in order to really resolve anxiety, we need to observe deeply how our mind is working in this very moment. Not to just think about how our mind is working and try to analyze it using the teachings of Buddhism to think, oh, well, yeah, in the Dharma talk, David said this, and yeah, I found that in a Buddhist sutra. This is the cause of anxiety and this and that. Thinking about it, analyzing it, only is the beginning. We need to observe. And how do we observe? Well, this is where the Buddhist practice of meditation and mindfulness comes in. Whether this is meditation, meaning sitting on a cushion or sitting on a chair quietly, reflecting inwardly on ourselves, or it could mean that just in daily life, we start to develop a capacity to be aware of what's happening within our mind in the very moment of the interactions we're having. So when we're talking to people, or when we get into possibly an argument, with practice, we can develop an awareness of our reactions. We can develop an awareness of how we start to make assumptions, how we start to think about things. And with regards to anxiety, how we start to catastrophize and imagine all of the bad outcomes. The more we can see that process happening in real time, the more we'll experience that it's just thoughts. It's just thoughts and the emotions that arise because of it. And because we can experience in the moment that those are just passing thoughts, we all of a sudden have this distance now. Kind of like I mentioned before, where we take the virtual reality viewfinder and we just put it away from our eyes. All of a sudden we see it's just a bunch of flickering lights and sounds. That's like having an awareness in the moment of the workings of our mind, of thought, emotion, as well as even attention, how we pay attention to things, and how when we pay attention to something, then that quickly can stir up an association and then lead to a chain of associations and so on. So the Buddhist practice of developing awareness can be sequential though. Starting from the foundation of sitting meditation is a good place to start because it's such a safe environment, minimal distraction, that we can put all of our attention on our internal condition. What's arising? What are the thoughts, the feelings, and the impulses that are arising? starting with sitting meditation and beginning with methods like relaxation. Relaxation can sound pretty superficial. You may think like, oh, I came to this Buddhist talk, and when he talks about method, all he says is just relax. But what's amazing about the practice of relaxation is that on the surface, yes, we're just relaxing our muscles, but we're also, in a way, telling ourselves, or we're allowing our body and mind to, in the face of anxiety, we're allowing ourselves to be more at ease with a potential threat, right? So it's kind of like if we if we encounter something which is dangerous, but we've cultivated this practice of relaxing in the face of danger, it totally changes how we can respond to the situation. So um, I won't use the bear example for this one, but if we encounter, let's say, an aggressive person, maybe you have someone at the workplace who is quite aggressive in how they talk. And you may feel anxious just about going to work because you're just like, oh, I hate when this person does this, and he always makes me feel stupid. And you start to think of all the possible negative outcomes of engaging with this person. There's probably a lot of tension there because the state of mind is resistance. If we're resisting, anxious about an outcome and resisting, our body will become tense. If we train ourselves to relax, even when the thoughts of the anxious thoughts are, arising, immediately, immediately we start to diffuse that resistance. Relaxing physically can help us relax mentally and start to release these patterns of resistance and even fearing negative outcomes to the point where we can um, be accepting of any outcome. We can start to develop an attitude that we can still make plans and try to avoid, danger, try to avoid uh, uh, misfortune and problematic outcomes. But our attitude is that no matter what happens, I can be relaxed. No matter what happens, I can be at peace, which totally diffuses the anxiety. So relaxation sounds like a very basic practice, and it can begin with a basic superficial muscular relaxation. But eventually, it can lead to a deeper internal relaxation of attitude, which diffuses resistance and then diffuses the cyclic pattern of anxiety or anxious thinking. We start to be able to release um, that habit of worry. And the more relaxed we are, actually, the more subtle our awareness is. If we're very tense, for example, and there's um, a certain feeling in the body, it's going to be hard to notice it because there's so much happening with our tension. If we are relaxed and there's a feeling, let's say, in the chest of discomfort, we'll be able to recognize that very quickly. When we can recognize the feeling, the emotional, or the feeling that's occurring due to emotion in our chest or in our stomach, very quickly we'll be able to become aware of the thinking um, that's driving those feelings. So relaxation going from the superficial to the deep can be um, a very transformative practice to help deal with anxiety. There are other methods, breathing methods that can help calm us, either in the moments of panic attacks or just to help us find calm with a more persistent kind of anxiety. But eventually, the practice of Buddhist meditation or the practice of um, observing our mind in Buddhism helps us to see the mechanism of attachment to thinking, attachment to concept, self-concept, other concept, those four concepts I mentioned. When we can become clearly aware of the mechanism of attachment to those concepts, and we can see them clearly as concepts, then we become free. We don't have to get rid of thinking or get rid of concepts because they're very useful. There's no problem with thoughts in themselves. The problem is the lack of awareness, ignorance. When there's lack of awareness, thoughts and thinking become our burden. When there's awareness, and in Buddhism, the ideal of complete awareness, that's what Buddha or Buddhahood means. When there's complete awareness, thoughts are just kind of wisdom, a tool to communicate, tool to respond to others, a tool to navigate the world. So Buddhist meditation is really about going from lack of awareness, lack of clarity, to awareness, clarity of how the mind is working so that it frees us from anxiety and all kinds of distress. In the Chan tradition, it's quite simple. The methods are very simple, but the principle is the same, where a person can suddenly, because of awareness, awareness of attachment, we can suddenly drop that attachment or fixation to thoughts and ideas and suddenly be free. Does it mean we'll be a Buddha free forever, completely without any kinds of anxiety and disease? No. But the Chan tradition just emphasizes that the moment that we practice, or the moment that we have awareness, in that moment, there's freedom. So I'll give an example. Um, when I was at the retreat center, there was another monk who had to lead a retreat, uh, but he wasn't prepared. The original plan was that we would show videos from Master Sheng Yen leading a retreat in the past. So those videos would be the main content. And this monk was all prepared that the videos were supposed to, arrive in the mail and we would use those. His English wasn't so fluent at the time, so the videos were perfect. But it turns out the videos wouldn't arrive on time. And he may have had to lead the retreat himself and speak in English. And he was very nervous about that. So he told me, he's like, oh man, I don't know if I could lead this retreat by myself. Are they going to be able to understand what I'm saying? He was quite anxious about it. But then the videos came in the mail and suddenly he was free. Suddenly he was free from all anxiety because the videos showed up in the mail and he could put them, use them to as the teaching material. So that change of mindset was sudden, from anxiety, worrying about how it's going to go, to sudden freedom. Yes, that situation was dependent on a change of external circumstance. The videos showed up, but I think it just illustrates how quickly our minds can change from suddenly immersed in anxiety or from persistent immersion in anxiety and suffering to sudden freedom. So actually, the same freedom and shift of mindset could have happened even if those videos didn't show up. With awareness, when we can become aware of the cause of our anxiety, that attachment and fixation to the movies of our mind, in that very moment is the potential for freedom and to release it, to be free from worry, yet still use our mind to think and to respond. So it's about awareness. That's what the core of Buddhism is teaching, is the resolution to all these kinds of anxieties, is awareness, awareness of the cause. Awareness of the cause, we can resolve it. So do Buddhas panic? To get back to the opening or the title of the talk, well, Buddhas who are not yet awakened, those are called ordinary beings or ordinary people. Buddhas who are awakened, well, they're Buddhas. Or people who are unawakened were just ordinary folks. The moment of awakening is Buddha. If we experience one moment of awakening, that's one moment of Buddha or the experience of the Buddha. But if we're then unaware again, well, then our anxiety comes back. If we're completely aware, completely awakened, then we would say that's complete Buddhahood. But in reality, the process is there. In our current state of being now, we're often unaware of what's going on in our mind. However, if we practice, we develop that awareness, we develop that capacity to be clear about ourselves. And gradually, bit by bit, we resolve our anxieties. And I hope you have faith that even though you may feel a great deal of anxiety now, that you have the potential for being free from it at every moment. So I'd like to finish the talk here, and we still have some time if you folks would like to engage in some Q&A or even just provide me some feedback. Just so you know, we won't post the Q&A online, right? Once we record the video and put it on the channel, we won't include the Q&A. So if you have any things you'd like to ask or discuss, feel free.